mass marketing and idolization like Frida has. But the interesting thing is that she has resisted. And so a few months ago there was an exhibit of her, and it was about her photography. But get this, it was not photographs she had taken. It was not even photographs of her exclusively. It was photographs that she collected. And you would say, well, that's a little difficult association, right? Well, it worked. Because Frida has so good taste and is so intelligent that the photographs that she collected throughout her life are interesting, are remarkable. We have seen the publication of her diaries, of her letters, and the same thing. We find that her writing is wonderful. Even the daughter of Diego Rivera published, there's seats over here, guys, if anybody needs a seat, by all means, don't stand here. And that way you make everybody warmer with your presence. Come in and sit over here. And they did all these books on her recipes. Imagine that one. It's called Frida's Fiestas. And again, it turns out that Frida had an exquisite series of dishes that she prepared. Her clothes, the same thing. What am I trying to say is that I think that Frida's main creation was not just her art, but also her life, herself. She is, in a way, her own creation. And this is doubly impressive if you think that Frida was a woman that could have been a cripple, could have spent all of her life in bed, had terrible fractures, had more than 30 surgeries in her spine. And what is remarkable is that she could transform that pain into art and, in a way, defy the world. But for any who has experienced the excruciating pain of a back surgery, to be able to act as if you didn't have it, and to have a full love life and a full art life when you're dying all the time, when you are suffering a level of pain that requires morphine, and to have the fortitude to ignore that pain and to let nobody have pity on you. A woman that has a withered leg because of her polio, and still can use these dresses to cover her broken body and come across as beautiful and in many ways defy a fashion that is oppressive. I mean, most of these men that design clothes for women hate women. They do. I mean, the average model of a Vogue magazine, to look like that, you have to have a nutritional level comparable to somebody on a concentration camp. Yeah, to look like Kate Moss. Yeah. So all these unattainable models are terribly destructive. So Frida defies them, and if she has a mustache, she wears her mustache. You know? And in a way, her power is such that she can change the environment around her. So, as Carlos Monsiváis used to say, that the true scandal of Frida Kahlo was not that she had men and women lovers, was not that the true rebellion of Frida Kahlo is a rebellion against pain, against sickness, against sorrow. This is a cartoon of Frida and Diego. In their life, Frida was often referred to as the wife of Diego Rivera, but more and more Diego is known as the husband of Frida Kahlo. But in a deeper level, I think that the charisma of Frida has to do with the fact that she is perhaps the most multicultural of artists. She embraces all of the different strains in Mexican culture and puts them together. And she is the daughter of a father that is European and a mother that is indigenous. She would paint this several times. So you see the European part and the Indian part in her. But more importantly, she would be able to incorporate the cultures. For example, you see the influence of an Indian art, and then what Frida does, she's not copying it, but she's kind of recreating it in her art. Here you have another example of an Aztec sculpture, and then a painting that she does. But Frida also incorporates the European part of her legacy. This is a painting by Jose Maria Estrada, and here you see Frida's work. She also builds on the popular traditions of Mexico. In some regions of Mexico, when little kids die, they bury them according to the name that they were baptized after. So for example, this kid is dressed according to Saint Dimas. And Frida does this work and he calls it Dressed for Paradise. Then in Mexico, in the churches of Mexico, you have a lot of these, what we call milagros, that are these paintings that people do when they receive grace. They ask for something and it's conceded to you. So then you go and you do these little paintings where, for example, this man was saved from lightning. And so he does this painting and he takes it to the church. So Frida does that. She paints exactly the same. So she's using this type of work, not copying it, but expressing herself through this. And she also does it in her way of she dresses. You see the hairstyles that she uses. Or she sometimes combines different elements. For example, here you see the indigenous women, the Tehuanas. And these are the crowned nuns, las monjas coronadas. We have a couple of seats over here, two over here, over there. And so what does Frida do? She takes the costume of the Tehuanas and some elements of the nun. So what Frida does is like if, say, somebody in the US were able to incorporate white culture, the black culture, the Indian culture, and give it all a unity. Make something original with all of the differences that exist around her. So I think that what happens is that most people that look at Frida's work find it familiar. It's not like you're looking at something that feels foreign. I've given lectures of her in Europe and Asia, and people connect with her. They find that she's got elements that they identify with. This is the house where she was born. It's called the Blue House, and is now a museum. And she was born a year after her little brother had died. So the mother was still in mourning, and right after she was born, her sister Cristina was born. So she never really bonded with the mother. And it was necessary to hire an Indian nanny, like a wet nurse, that she would paint in this painting. And she would present her with this Indian mask as if to say that she was nourished not just by an individual, but by a culture, right? And Frida was a very active girl in a house of women. But when she's about 7 or 8 years old, she starts developing a lot of pain in her right leg. And it turns out that she's got polio. And so it's not the worst kind of polio because she's able to walk again. But she has to stay without movement for many months. And in this period, Frida imagines, she's bedridden, she can't move. And so she imagines a friend that comes and visits her and plays with her. So what I find interesting is how Frida uses her imagination to compensate for the lack of physical mobility. This would happen later on in her art. So in many of her works, this is perhaps her most famous painting called The Two Fridas. And she would paint this kind of like doubling of herself. This Frida that would console another Frida. The mother was intensely religious, and she was very neurotic. The first lover of her before she met Frida's father had committed suicide in her presence. So she always felt guilty, and she tried to compensate that guilt by praying all the time. So Frida would later be a communist, and she would not be religious at all as an adult. But as a girl, she would go to Mass every day. And this would have a deep impact on her. You would later see how a lot of her iconography is religious iconography, even if she herself is not Catholic. But some of the images that she uses are religious. And the father was a great influence in her life. The father was a German-Hungarian Jew. And he was a photographer. So this man taught Frida how to look at the world. On the one hand, he was a foreigner, so everything he saw in Mexico that a lot of Mexicans took for granted, for him, it was a novelty. It was something that... And later, Frida became her assistant, and she learned to retouch his photography. So a lot of Frida's technique is really photographic, more than pictorial. The father would also introduce her to the microscope. And they would go on these trips, and they would collect all these little insects and things that they would later look at in the microscope. We have 3 seats over here, huh? If anybody needs a seat, there's 3 over here. And these images, these magnified images, would later be part of her art. So if you look at some of her works, look at the details of these leaves. It's almost like if you were looking at them in a microscope. We have 3 chairs here, 2 there, and 3 over there. So you guys over there in the back, no need to be so far. Come closer, it's warmer. Even this portrait that she does of her father, look in the back, she does it like sperms. So a lot of people, when they look at Frida, and they say, oh, it's like a dream. No, it's a magnified reality that you see in the background. And the influence of photography is evident also in the way she composes her images. This painting, for example, is exactly like if it were a photograph. The way the portrait is the poser. Another great influence in her life was the revolution. But Frida did not paint revolutionary subjects like Diego Rivera. She did one painting inspired in Pancho Villa and the soldaderas. But most of her influence had to do with her political agenda. Her idea that art should be for the people and not for the wealthy. That art has a social commitment. That you must make art accessible to everyone. That art is a right of people, as the right of education or the right of health. All these ideas that would be define Mexican culture were very much her own. And this man, Jose Vasconcelos, is my great inspiration. The reason that we're doing Arcos is, among other things, to try to change education in this country. How can we make the classes more exciting, more inspiring, and not the dry drudgery that so frequently happens with teachers that have less and less freedom and more testing. You know? So our idea is, how can we enliven the act of teaching? We're going to start training teachers also as part of our program. So Vasconcelos has this idea that you should expose art to the young. That every school should have murals and paintings, which, you know, is surprising. I mean, we see in Los Angeles that has done this wonderful construction of schools, but there's very little art there. We need to do better in that way. And so these murals were created in the high school where Frida was a student. She wasn't in the high school, she was about 16 or 17. And Diego Rivera came to do this big mural. And Diego was immensely fat, but women adored him. He was very charismatic. He could talk. And so all these women had the obsession of feeding Diego Rivera. They all felt it was very romantic to bring him food to the scaffold. So Diego ate it also. Frida she was this mischievous girl, and she saw one of the models come, says, "Cuidado, Diego, here comes your wife." And then here comes, with the wife here comes Naviolina. Like, so one day she told her friends that the illusion of her life was to someday have the child of Diego Rivera. She said, as soon as I convince him to cooperate. But, and this is the auditorium of Frida's high school. And this is Diego Rivera's first mural. Now, at the time, Frida wanted to be a doctor. Frida never decided to become formally an artist. She wanted to be a doctor, and so she was studying science. And she was the girlfriend of this guy called Alejandro Gomez Arias. And this is 1925. Frida was born in 1907. So that makes her what, 19? Somebody help me here. 18. And so she's riding in a bus. It was a very fragile bus, little primitive buses. And the bus turned a corner and was smashed by a trolley. The electrical trolley hit the bus against the wall. And so Frida moved toward the back of the bus because the boyfriend had given her a little toy, un valero. And so she went back to pick it right when the little bus exploded. And one of the metal rods of the bus crossed her from the back through her body. Frida would say that she had lost her virginity in the accident. It completely destroyed her and broke several of her vertebrae and her pelvis. In addition of profound abdominal wounds. At first, when the paramedics came to the accident scene, they thought that Frida was dead. She was covered in this puddle of blood. And then it is said that when they pulled the metal out of her body, her scream was so intense that you could not listen to the silence. So they take her to this, interestingly, in the hospital, she would write this kind of birth certificate, in which she would say that that day Leonardo was born, like if she invented a birth of her accident. And then they take her back to her house, but because she's broken her column, she has to be totally still. And the mother tries to find something for her to do, so she gets her an easel she can paint. She would write a letter to her boyfriend that is very dramatic. He says, "You don't know how terrible it is to acquire knowledge suddenly, as if lightning struck the earth. Now I live on a cold planet, transparent like ice. My girlfriends became women slowly. I grew up in a few instants." In other words, that this closeness with death makes her lose any illusions of anything. She would say, "I know there's nothing behind the door," meaning no afterlife, no nothing. "I know there's nothing behind the door. If there were, I would feel it." So it is in this condition where she becomes an artist. I mean, imagine it's a teenage girl that suddenly feels that she probably will never be able to move again, that everything is escaping her. So she writes the boyfriend all these letters. But soon the letters are not enough. So she sends these paintings that she does, mainly paintings of herself. And she tells the boyfriend, she refers to the painting as if it were herself. She says, "Put the painting where it can see you," as if the painting were a way that she could rebuild her broken body. These are some of the self-portraits that she would do. Once Picasso saw Frida's work, and he wrote to Diego, he says, "Nor you nor anyone else, nor me nor anyone else, can paint heads like Frida Kahlo." Now, Frida was able to walk again, and during her period in bed, she had done several works, and she wanted to get an opinion on these works. So she brought them to Diego Rivera for an opinion. And Diego was doing this mural, and he looked at the work, and he was very impressed by it. He said that the work had a basic honesty about it. So he started to, he was much older than Frida. He was more than 20 years older than she. But he started visiting her, and they fell in love, and they got married the 21st of August of 1929. Frida's mother said that this was like the wedding between an elephant and a dove, she said. They live a bit in Mexico, and then they come to the US, to California, to San Francisco. This is an interesting portrait. it is said that when an older man marries a younger woman, one would think that the younger woman becomes like the daughter of the older man, but apparently it doesn't work that way. Apparently the younger woman becomes like the mother of the older man. Never tried it, I don't know how accurate that might be, but certainly this painting would lead you to believe that, because Frida presents herself like the mother of Diego. He presents like this giant kid holding her hand, no? Su hijito, no? And more, Diego would function that way. At the end, she would paint him like a giant baby. She was bathing him. And her work is constantly evolving. She does this portrait of Luther Burbank where she is fusing this man with life and death. Then Diego Rivera in Detroit, would do these great murals, these great frescoes. And here you have them painting together. This is, of course, Diego and Frida. I think 32, yeah. And it's interesting, how different their works are. Diego does these huge murals, and Frida does tiny portraits. There you have it. Now, Frida was pregnant of Diego, but the problem, it has never been totally understood, but the idea is that because of the way that she broke her pelvis, she could never carry a baby to term. So every time that she was pregnant, her pregnancies ended up in miscarriages. And she tried several times, so this became like a recurrent obsession. But in this case, as in the accident before, Frida would transform this tragedy of her into art. She would paint herself in this bed, totally isolated, and then she would put all these symbols that would express how she was feeling, like the baby that she couldn't have. And then, this is like her broken pelvis, compared to a useless machine. She would, or her uterus. And the baby that she couldn't have. And she would express her sorrow in her art. But you see, the way that she could cope with things was by painting them, by trying to understand what had happened to her, by giving you all the details of what she had gone through. And she never stops working. This is a comparison that she would do of Mexico and the US. Then Diego creates, 80 years ago, a great scandal with this mural in New York. This is a mural that is destroyed because Diego includes the portrait of Lenin. And Frida's response is this painting called My Dress Hangs There. And she puts the monument to the toilet. In this garbage can, she puts a hand as to show that life is not. And then they return to Mexico, and Diego Rivera has an affair with the sister of Frida, Cristina. And for Frida, this is like a double betrayal, you know, of the husband and the sister. And she would do this work that shows a woman stabbed many times, and it has this certain like black humor that is so characteristic of Mexico. It says unos cuantos piquetitos. It's, you know, they arrest this man and say, how could you do that? And he says, si solamente le di unos cuantos piquetitos, I just gave her a few small nips. She would also do this work where she would put the dress that she was wearing when she met Diego, and then the one she wore when she was with him, and then look at her heart bleeding. But notice how the heart, it looks like right out of an anatomy book, perfectly drawn. Even in such a personal work. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that Diego was this awful philanderer and Frida was this just innocent young women waiting for her philandering husband. Frida had a lot of lovers. Perhaps the most, men and women, perhaps the most famous one was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky is the founder of the Red Army in the Soviet Union. And here you see Frida receiving Trotsky when he comes to Mexico. After the death of Lenin, there's a power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin that Stalin wins. And eventually, here you see Frida, eventually Trotsky is murdered in Mexico. Look at those flowers, beautiful. I wonder why nobody does these things. Why? Everybody imitates other things of Frida, but I don't see many women wearing flowers in their hair. Is it very difficult